Hi, I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and today I'm talking about King Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad. Charles VI was born in 1368 in the middle of the longest conflict in European history, the 100 Years' War. As king, he attracted two nicknames, Charles the Beloved and Charles the Mad. His reign was dominated by bouts of mental illness, and at one point he believed he was made of glass, and he took to wearing reinforced clothing and refused to let anyone touch him. What was the strange and hitherto unheard of disease that made his doctors drill into his skull in search of a cure? I'll be exploring the fascinating world of 14th century France, the world of the Last Duel, and of the Shakespeare history plays, and of a much-maligned monarch who signed away his kingdom to the English. In order to make sense of his life, we need to have at least some understanding of the devastating dynastic squabble between the royal houses of England and France, the 100 Years' War, and the Black Death, the most lethal pandemic in human history, which between them halved the population of France. After the Norman invasion of England in 1066, French kings sat on the English throne. They spoke French, their laws were in French, they married French women, and they rewarded French nobles with English lands, while still holding huge swathes of land in France, shown here in red. Though kings in England, their French lands made them vassals of the French king. In other words, they owed him allegiance, which they were not too keen on. But neither was the French crown comfortable with having such a powerful neighbour on its turf, so it gradually nibbled away at the historically English territory. In 1337, all that was left was Gascony, and when the French crown tried to take that as well, Edward III of England invaded with the intention of claiming the French throne. After successful battles for the English at Crécy and Poitiers, their luck turned. A freak hailstorm decimated Edward's army, forcing him to renounce his claim to the throne in exchange for extended land in Gascony. After a brief peace, Charles V, Charles the Mad's father, reinvigorated the French state and army, and recaptured most of the English-held territory. But his early death at the age of 42 in 1380 gave the throne to his 11-year-old son. Charles was placed under the regency of his uncles, who pursued their own selfish interests, leaving the teenage king to energetically indulge his passions for hunting and jousting, and, if the chroniclers, who described him as lusty with a strong carnal appetite, are to be believed, for other pleasures as well. At the age of 16, he was married to the 14-year-old Isabeau of Bavaria, who went on to bear him 12 children. When he was 20, the regency of his uncles was brought to an end by the former advisers to his father, but the young king left them to administer the state while he continued his sport. At the age of 23, he had his first bout of mental illness. He was attending one of many attempts to find a long-term peace with England at a Grand Palais in Amiens, when he became ill with a strange and hitherto unheard of disease. He had high fevers and bouts of delirium, and very unusually his hair and nails fell out. This has led to a suggestion that he may have had a rare inflammatory condition called sarcoidosis, which affected his brain. However, the chronicles record that many other courtiers were ill at the same time, which suggests to me that an infectious disease is more likely. Probably typhoid fever caused by the Salmonella bacterium, a major killer in the Middle Ages, which in severe cases can cause onycholysis, or nail loss. After a few months, he had recovered well enough to resume hunting, but then one of his most trusted advisers, the Constable of France, was attacked and left for dead. The perpetrator took refuge with the Duke of Brittany, an old adversary of the king. Charles was furious and wanted to take an army to punish the Duke immediately, but he was still having bouts of fever and not fully mentally recovered, as he was disconnected in his speech. Against the advice of his physicians, he set off with his army in July 1392, in the hottest summer for a generation, which caused widespread crop failure and livestock deaths. Progress was painfully slow, which drove him into a frenzy of impatience. The chronicles describe him as being like a man of unsound mind, uttering foolish words and gesticulating wildly. As Charles and his escort were travelling through a forest near Le Mans, a man in rags suddenly appeared, rushed up to the king's horse and grabbed the bridle. "Ride no further, noble king," he yelled. "Turn back, you are betrayed." The king's escort beat the man back, but did not arrest him, and he followed the procession for half an hour, repeating his cries and unsettling the king. When the company emerged from the forest at noon into the full sun of an open plain, a page dropped the king's lance, which clanged loudly against a helmet. Startled, Charles drew his sword and spurred his horse to attack his companions, believing them to be his enemies. Eventually, his men were able to get him off his horse and soak up his frenzied attack until he collapsed onto the ground, exhausted. He killed a knight and several other men. He was barely conscious for 2 days and talking gibberish. His physician, the 92-year-old Guillaume de Harsigny, diagnosed too much of the moisture of his mother, who had suffered a prolonged episode of postnatal depression after the birth of her 7th child. He was advised to rest, sleep, and to eat and drink well. This diagnosis reflects the humoral theory of medicine that dated back to ancient Greece, that health and illness were determined by the balance of the 4 humours in the body: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Taking their chance while Charles' humours were rebalancing, the uncles seized power again. In 1393, at a masked ball, later known as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, the king and several other lords were dancing, dressed up as wild men in shaggy costumes. One of the men caught fire, and the flames quickly spread. A duchess threw the train of her gown over the king to protect him, but 4 men died, and others were severely burned trying to put out the flames. A few months later, the king was making improper gestures and acting violently, and said to be covered by heavy shadows. When his wife came to visit, he asked his servants who she was, and ordered them to take care of what she required so that she would leave him alone. He declared he was not married, had never had children, was not the King of France, and was not called Charles. He defaced his coat of arms and that of his wife. This is often described in historical texts as him forgetting who he was, or not recognising his wife. But it is clear that he recognised all the officers of his household, so this was not confusion or delirium, and his symptoms sound more like someone with the nihilistic delusions of severe depression to me. At some point, his physicians carried out a trepanning procedure, drilling a hole in his skull, an operation that was surprisingly common in prehistoric Europe, but much less common in this era. Whether it was the interventions of his doctors or the natural history of his illness, he improved, and after 6 months he gave thanks for recovery at Mont Saint-Michel. Further episodes followed, however, and in 1395 he declared he was not a king and that his real name was Georges, and he again defaced his royal coat of arms. At times he would run wildly through the corridors of his Parisian residence, the Hôtel Saint-Paul, shrieking that he was escaping from his enemies, and to keep him inside, the entrances were walled up. After a few months, he gave thanks for his recovery at Notre Dame Cathedral. In the early stages of a relapse the following year, he asked that his dagger be taken away, and those of all of his courtiers. This shows that he had insight that he was becoming unwell, and was able to take sensible precautions before descending into madness once again. He continued to be involved in affairs of state when he was well, but these lucid intervals gradually got shorter and shorter. When unwell, he could be feverish and excitable, running about wildly and behaving grotesquely, breaking things, throwing precious objects into the fire, and urinating on expensive gowns. At other times he could be prostrate and listless, refusing to bathe or change his linen for months on end, resulting in skin problems and body lice. All sorts of explanations for the king's illness were suggested, including poisoning, sorcery, witchcraft, and demonic possession. The attempts at curing him reflected this thinking. He was exorcised more than once. He spent a week in isolated prayer. He was given diaphoretic medicines to make him sweat, and powdered pearls. In 1405, he had an early form of shock treatment to lift him from his months of inactivity and self-neglect. 10 men with blackened faces were introduced into his apartments to frighten him. Amazingly, this worked, and he agreed to start washing again. His wife was often the object of his resentment, and the rumours spread that she had a lover, the king's brother, the Duke of Orléans. Considerately, she allowed the king to have an agreeable and pleasing young woman to take her place, however, known as the Little Queen. Relations with his wife broke down completely in 1417, when he ordered her to disband her court at the Hotel Barbette, which had a reputation for gaiety, extravagance, and promiscuity. The king's later psychotic episodes are not described in detail, but Pope Pius II wrote in his commentaries that there were many times when Charles thought that he was made of glass, and tried to protect himself by having iron rods sewn into his clothing so that he would not shatter, and by not allowing anyone to touch him. Bizarre as it sounds, the glass delusion was not uncommon in Europe at this time, and there are many stories of people who felt that they had glass bones, glass heads, glass arms, or glass hearts. One man was so convinced his buttocks were made of glass that he would not sit down. Another was afraid to leave the house in case a glazier tried to melt him down to turn him into a window pane. The king's illness created a power vacuum, and the battles between his uncles, his wife, and brother Louis plunged France into civil war. If that were not bad enough, Henry V of England took advantage of his weakness to invade and utterly crushed his army in 1415 at Agincourt.
Once more into the breach, dear friend! Once more!
Charles was left with no choice but to sign a humiliating treaty, which entirely disinherited his son and made Henry V regent and heir to the throne of France. In the summer of 1422, he fell ill with quartan fever or malaria, and a few months later, Charles VI died. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on where your allegiance lies, Henry V died just a few weeks before him. His infant son, and Charles's grandson, then became King Henry VI of England and France. His reign, however, was plagued by bouts of mental illness like his grandfather, which allowed Charles's disinherited son, the Dauphin, to reignite the fight against the English. Assisted by the divine interventions of Joan of Arc, he was crowned King Charles VII and became known as Charles the Victorious, and he was able to finally defeat the English and end the 100 Years' War in 1453. Although making modern diagnoses on historical figures is fraught with difficulties, I'm going to do so anyway. I don't think there is enough evidence to say that Charles the Mad had neurosarcoidosis, nor do I believe that he had syphilis, as some have suggested, as it probably wasn't present in Europe at this time. Many have concluded that he had schizophrenia, but I think the modern diagnosis that fits most closely is bipolar affective disorder, or what used to be called manic depression. He had documented episodes of overactive and disinhibited behaviour, with contrasting episodes of taking to his bed and neglecting his hygiene. These sound to me like manic and depressive episodes. His first attack of madness may have been a manic episode, but it sounds as if he was not fully recovered from a severe case of typhoid, and ignoring his doctors, he insisted on travelling in unusually hot weather. The chronicles even record that he was wearing a black tunic. All this suggests to me that he probably suffered heat stroke, proving the old adage that only mad dogs and Englishmen, and perhaps the odd French king, go out in the midday sun. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.
Needed and wanted.
That's a very interesting point of view.
Oh, do you feel the breeze from the subway? Isn't it delicious?